when the reality is that a lot of the threats to environmental and biocultural diversity are related to wealth and consumption and stemming from distant geographies. And all of that really points towards this clear need to have some transformations in business as usual and in the patterns of and flows that stem from centers of wealth. How can they be transformed? And perhaps, how might conservation better approach those drivers? And it's interesting presenting this at the GLP because, of course, there's lots of land system scientists who I think are actually a group really aware of the flows between places. But that doesn't mean that even in the conservation agenda at the high level, we've got international, I think, also acknowledgement of the role of wealth, but it's not yet transferred into really redefining what conservation does. And so we argue in this paper that in the contemporary conservation sort of agenda, if you like, there is an overemphasis on site-level interventions. A lot of conservation action is operating in rural places that are both biologically diverse and culturally diverse, and therefore places where it makes sense to do conservation, which is true to some extent, but I think there are some considerable issues with the way in which conservation operationalizes at the site level. Often, for instance, trying to introduce alternative livelihoods as though livelihoods in place are the problem, or protected areas, disconnecting people from their places. And actually, as the work by Garnett and others shows, it is exactly in those biocultural centres, which are often lands held and managed by indigenous peoples and local communities, where we see most of the low-intensity anthromes around the planet. So, if anything, really, these are places where the values and the governance and the knowledges are actually proving consonant with nature, and nature is doing well. So this model of conservation that's focusing so sort of overemphasizing the site level is at the same time exonerating those distant actors who have a huge role in the biodiversity crisis. And also potentially misses an opportunity to learn from these alternatives, these sites of biocultural diversity where different forms of organization and values and knowledges are holding on and actually showing maybe lessons that could be transferable into centers of wealth that might rebalance our own relationship with nature. So in a sister paper, we also go on to sort of unpack why this focus on the site level and this sort of whole endeavor to resolve poverty, which appears to be a virtuous act, sort of propagating white savior colonial style narratives. But that was originally in the initial conservation, connected conservation paper, and then it became just too big. So we had to separate them, and that's a sister paper which is currently in review. And so this is the model in a visual sense. Basically, what we have on the left are the dominant flows of trade, climate change, one world development, all of which are dominating and which are debasing or undermining biodiversity and also biocultural diversity. And so this model of conservation, and in the paper what we set out is a number of different actions that maybe conservation could better engage, operating across these different levers of governance, of economy, of individual and collective action, of science and technology, to disrupt and diminish those negative flows. And in the paper we give a bunch of examples, and today we're going to hear about some of them too. And what we argue is conservation isn't active enough in that space and needs to have better interdisciplinary connections with potentially sort of unusual suspects that haven't been our collaborators necessarily in most of the conservation agenda so far. And then on the right side here we see the marginalized flows, but they're actually the ones which are enabling biodiversity, local governance, diverse knowledges and plural values, which stem from biocultural centers, and which conservation, some conservation of course does already operate to enhance and amplify and empower those realities, but we suggest that there might be more challenging and more interesting and maybe more imaginative ways for conservation to work in that space. And then in this sort of model, working towards the centre, which is, of course, when you're writing about what should conservation do other than what it normally does, you need to also say why and where would it end up. And so together it's a group of quite a lot of different authors from different disciplines. We define these 4 different sort of ideal states, if you like, which conservation could be pushing and contributing to move towards: gratification, not growth, and accountable trade and centres of wealth, and then autonomy and rights, and knowledge and value diversity in biocultural centres. And the most challenging part of that is that ideally, all of those actions across the threat chain, across scales, would be organised to operate in concert, to focus on one particular conservation challenge. And I think there are some instances where that type of arrangement is happening, like perhaps illegal wildlife trade is one where there's quite a lot of work at both ends of the spectrum and across the whole threat chain. And so there are lessons perhaps to be learned. And we're going to hear about some work on fire, which is happening at different points in that threat chain. Rainforest fires in particular, because they're a particular fire type that cause extreme environmental and cultural damages. And so that's the paper, and the QR code will take you there. And that was really just a quick intro to the session and to the concept. And happy to talk more about that if anyone has questions. And now I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, which is Joaquín Rodriguez from the University of East Anglia, who will take us into the space on the right, which was enhancing, amplifying, and empowering biocultural centres. Could we have the next presentation, please?
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Rachel said, my name is Joaquín Rodriguez. I'm from Venezuela, but I'm a researcher at the University of East Anglia and a lecturer. And I'm going to be putting a focus on one part of this whole concept. And one thing that Rachel didn't explain in detail was that the connected conservation concept or model has a lot of focus on justice. So that the idea is, behind this concept is the search for justice and equity in conservation from the global level to the local level. I'm going to be exploring a little bit what that means in terms of knowledge, in terms of cognitive justice, as a process and means for connected conservation. I'm going to be focusing on work I've been doing for the last 20 years in 3 different places in Venezuela, in Guyana, and in Bolivia. With an intention of contributing to this concept, although when I started working on it, I didn't refer to it as cognitive justice as such. So I'm going to be, first of all, setting the scene of why justice matters for connected conservation and fire management, exploring a little bit how I'm defining cognitive justice for connected conservation, and then giving some examples, I hope I can manage in 10 minutes, of how I've been trying to contribute to this process of cognitive justice in fire management, and some key transformations that I've seen through this work, and challenges ahead for enhancing cognitive justice in this concept of connected conservation in the particular context of indigenous peoples' territories. So setting the scene, probably many of you are aware, this is a bit of a global context. Climate change production has been historically, but increasingly more now with the more concerns for climate change, is dominated largely by this view of bad fires, which is complicated by the fact that there's an increasing flammability, so there is actually a concern, a real reason to be worried. But this is coupled with a process that is also complex, which is a process of cultural change that is also producing erosion of indigenous and local knowledges of fire. And another sort of contextual issue is the fact that there is a global integrated fire management agenda that is trying to respond to these challenges, but is largely dominated by conservation objectives. Fire management objective is not really set in the context, to a large extent, of what indigenous peoples themselves view as fire management for their own stewardship processes. So this is, there is a global context, which we see in a lot of Latin American countries, of increasing criminalization of indigenous uses of fire. As a result of cultural change, we see, on the one hand, loss of knowledge, but on the other hand, indigenous knowledge being made invisible by these fire narratives, and fire management policies that are largely dominated by conservation intentions. And very little efforts to strengthen indigenous fire management stewardship as part of their territorial management approaches. And this is highly problematic in terms of cognitive justice, because it's not helping to strengthen indigenous processes of fire management. So how am I understanding cognitive justice in this context? So as Rachel presented the graph of connected conservation, it has these two parts, the global context and the more place-based. My work has been more on the place-based dimension, because I've been working with indigenous peoples where their knowledge systems have been precisely made invisible and threatened by external policy making around fire management. So the idea is that cognitive justice, or bringing in a dialogue of knowledges within this context of connected conservation, could help or should help in creating an opportunity for marginalized forms of knowledge to come in contact with other forms of knowledge by strengthening diverse knowledge systems and paying attention to plural values of nature. So this is what the connected conservation concept seeks, and this is largely what my work in doing research on indigenous fire management also seeks. So there is an intention behind the search for cognitive justice of creating dialogues of knowledge and recognizing knowledges that are being made invisible by global and national policy making. However, the context is, as I said before, of large power asymmetries, where there's very little condition for this dialogue of knowledge to take place, unless there's an intention from somebody to help create that dialogue. What we see, in fact, is in many places, and this is what I started seeing 20 years ago when I started working on this in Venezuela, a huge communication breakdown. So this is two quotations that I have. One from an indigenous chief who is experiencing or transmitting his frustration with government policy-making agencies, that he said they always come here to criticize how we work, the burning of the savannas, etc., without even trying to understand how indigenous peoples live or think. I know what I'm doing when I burn the savannas, but instead of asking me how I think and why I act as I act, they come to tell me that I should do things in a certain way. So that is the communication breakdown with the policymakers. And then on the other hand, we have a communication breakdown with the youth who have already started assimilating this discourse of negative fire. And so this is the example of a young Pemon who says, I'm sick and tired of fire. Sometimes I feel ashamed when people ask me why there are so many fires and I have no way to answer them. Then I close my ears. I always say, they just do it for sheer pleasure. And I tell them that when the grandparents are gone, there will be no more fires. And I think it will be better this way. This is highly problematic, because actually if the elders die, when they die, there will be nobody to do the correct fire management system. So there's a need to really create some sort of bridges for dialogues of knowledge. And this is where people like us, academics with our methodologies, can create some sort of processes for dialogue through participatory research. So I am basically understanding cognitive justice and conservation beyond methodologies for communities and indigenous peoples to be partners as researchers, to respond to conservation interventions. Beyond that, to really be able to respond to the indigenous imperatives of local communities. And these indigenous imperatives are basically the agenda that many indigenous peoples have, which is self-determination. So the intention of dialogue of knowledge is not merely for improving fire management, and the intention should be, according to the concept of cognitive justice that I use, which is informed by decolonial scholars, is to really confront the existing relations of domination in the way that knowledge is produced, and to help strengthen what indigenous peoples themselves consider theirs in relation to their identities, their own differences and their own knowledge. So there is an emphasis, first of all, on contributing to the self-determination agendas of indigenous peoples, and secondly, or along with that, an emphasis on reconstructing, recovering, and revaluing their knowledge as part of this process. So very, very briefly, how I've done this. I've been working, as I said, in Venezuela. I still sort of linked to work on that, but largely for 10 years. Then I went to the Wapishana, South Rupununi territory, and more recently in Bolivia. I'm going to be referring very briefly, very, very briefly, to how this was done. I'm not going to be referring to the outcomes of the research on fire. There are publications that I can refer you to if you want to learn about what came out of the research on fire. Basically, what the message I want you to take is that the way we do research on fire matters, and that cognitive justice matters to help strengthen indigenous fire management regimes in this context of great power asymmetries. So, okay. So the three processes in which I have developed my fire research have been linked to different self-determination agendas. In the case of Venezuela, I was really not doing fire as part of an intention to do fire on its own. It was part of a community-led process, which was the development of a life plan, and that it was developed through the request of a particular village in the south of Conn National Park where I worked. It was doing this life plan, through this particular self-determination agenda, that by evaluating the changes in the culture and the territory, there was the window was open to start doing research on fire. And well, I won't go into detail. I'll explain a little bit more what we did the research on. But if it hadn't been for that particular self-led, community-led initiative, I would never have been able to do research on fire, because the communication breakdown that I was telling you about. There's very little opportunities for people to open up to talk about this. It's a very sort of hidden topic, and a lot of rejection to talk about it, because the Pemon indigenous peoples felt that they were continuously being stigmatized and threatened, and they just didn't want to talk about it. The other one was a territorial management plan that the Wapishana were doing in South Rupununi with European Union funding, with the Forest Peoples Program. And one of the issues that they identified there that they had really a lot of doubts about was fire. They were seeing that there's a breakdown in the fire management system, and they wanted to do research. So they asked me, after the experience that I had with the Pemon, to help them facilitate a process of indigenous sort of research on fire. So I went there. And then more recently, I've been working since 2014 in Bolivia, in the Moncoche indigenous territory, helping to strengthen indigenous sort of territorial management. And again, forest fires have become really, really bad there, and we started doing research on fire more recently there. Let's see if I can move on to. So we've used all sorts of, basically it's a participatory process where indigenous peoples themselves do their own research, and I facilitate with some guiding points and methodologies. The issues that we have explored in the three cases have all revolved around understanding the cultural values of fire, the uses of fire management, causes of fire, and understanding the customary rules and methods for preventing large fires. In the case of the Rupununi, we have also they also wanted help with identifying key components for a protocol, for a fire management protocol. And in the case of Lomerío, actually their intention was to do the same that we had done in the other two cases, but to start evaluating some fire management protocols that they had started putting in practice, and they wanted to see if the communities were really respecting them. So it was all about understanding the uses of fire, understanding the changes in the use of fire, and evaluating the application of fire management protocols. It was the most important thing to consider here is that because of this process being led by communities through community processes, it opened opportunities for dialogue between between indigenous sort of youth and elders, and between fire management that were not happening, basically. And so key transformations that we've seen, well, using a conflict transformation approach, which is what I work with, as some of my friends know, what I've seen with all this 20 years of work is that creating these spaces of cognitive justice, as I call them, are hugely valuable, first of all, on a personal level, in terms of strengthening the sense of dignity and identity of the people that are involved in the process in the communities, and having a space to talk about fire in their own terms and not by external agendas. In the case of all the cases, we've seen a process of revitalization of fire management systems, helping elders explain to youth how fire should really be used, and unpacking some doubts about the correct uses and inadequate uses of fire. Giving visibility of indigenous knowledge through publications that have come around. Creating counter-narratives of fire, in the case of Venezuela, through doing research with the PEMON, it created a huge opportunity for ecologists to start exploring and giving validity to the knowledge of the PEMON. And then at a relational level, this process is really hugely important in terms of opening spaces for inter-community dialogue and clarification of these doubts, and helping to evaluate the application of fire management protocols. Structurally, huge importance in terms of creating these protocols of fire management that create a common agreements on how communities should be using adequately fire. So I can't go into detail of all these different things in the examples, but I'm leaving here with you articles that we've published together with colleagues for the case of Venezuela, in the case of Rupununi, and more recently in the case of Bolivia, that really explain in detail how this process, as I call it, of reflexive governance, which is linked to the search for cognitive justice, have taken place. And there's also the link of a photo voice book that has been part of the youth being involved in doing research on fire in the case of Bolivia. Challenges ahead. Oh, well, this is important before I mention the challenges. There is a limit in terms of how useful this processes can be in the global context. I'll leave the slide there. Communities are demanding more of external intervention for large destructive fires that are encroaching in their territories. And challenges ahead, I'll leave the slide there for you to read because my time has come out. I'm happy to expand on those if anybody of you wants to. Thank you so much. So, Sherry, or do you want me to introduce Sherry?
Yes, thanks. So maybe we have some time for questions at the end, but now we'll have to continue to the next speaker. And I'm very happy to invite Sherry to the stage, and she will talk about law as a possible lever of governance.
Hi, I'm Sheree Lehman-Richardson. I'm a lawyer based in the UK. I'm at the University of East Anglia, and I'm doing research on a new international crime of ecocide. I'm in the first year of my PhD, so I don't have any results to tell you at the moment. Previously, I've worked in international criminal justice and human rights. So, as we all know, the environment is suffering hugely ongoing degradation. Industrial pollution, land and water contamination, obviously climate change, biodiversity decline, and the planetary boundaries have, of course, been exceeded in a lot of areas. So, looking at that in combination with the law, we are partly, or I would argue we are partly in this situation because the law is inadequate to deal with the degradation that is occurring. Mainly, internationally, the law and the regulations that exist are they're soft law and regulatory. There are various international treaties that, of course, try and limit degradation, environmental degradation, but they're inconsistently applied across nation states. There's limited sanctions for breaches of the treaties and largely lack of accountability. And these two things, the environment, the implications of what has been happening, and the degradation and the law, has of course led to health and well-being implications for people and nature in combination. So this is it's changed a bit from how I wrote it, but this was just it's not a penal code legal system, it's just a legal system we have in the UK and across the West. Just to give you for those that don't have too much legal background, it's just to give you an idea of the framework that the law of ecocide would operate within. So we've got obviously our national legal systems, which is the constitution, the government, and then we've got the judiciary, so the criminal and civil law. And regulations and soft law at the bottom. And environmental protection in green is actually supposed to sit underneath where it says the judiciary. So that's of course largely the system of law we use, well, is the system of law we use in the UK. All of that is also fed into by the international laws, the international legal system, which exists of treaties that have been signed and ratified between in countries, and also customary, so it's law that's become customary over time just by various practices. And at the top of all that, we've got the International Criminal Court, which is in The Hague. Currently there's 124 member states, which just means that the international criminal law will only apply within those member states. And at the moment there's 4 core crimes, being the crime of aggression, which was only added recently, war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. So the crimes that are most serious. If ecocide was to be added, it would be amongst those 4 core crimes, and there is a huge call for ecocide to be added to the International Criminal Court in nation states, organizations, which I will read out. I can't remember them all off by heart, so I will just read them out for you. So, ecocide, so I'll explain what this is first. Ecocide was introduced in the 70s by Arthur Gelston, who he coined the term and said that the use of Agent Orange in the war in Vietnam was an ecocide. The concept was then taken up and applied in the legal context. It was included in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court originally, but for reasons which are very unclear and are likely to do with nuclear weapons, it was taken out of the Rome Statute, so it was never included in the end. And at the moment, there is a huge international campaign to get it added to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, so large-scale degradation of the environment would then become illegal. This has been endorsed by several countries, including France, including Brazil, Mexico, the Pacific Island states, Italy, Azerbaijan, and many others. It's also a crime in many I think it's about 12 countries at the moment, including France, Belgium, Ukraine, and Russia. But it has been endorsed by a lot of international legal and political communities, including the EU Parliament, the International Interparliamentary Union, the International Corporate Governments Union, the World Council of Churches, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, the New Islamic Charter Al-Mizan, indigenous and faith leaders and scientists across the globe. Also, the Dominican Republic of Congo, Finland, Canada, and other countries have also endorsed it at an international level. So it is something that is being seriously considered, and it is also at the stage of formal consideration at the International Criminal Court. The legal definition was written up 2 years ago by the International Expert Panel for the international crime, and that is unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So if that within that definition, every word also has a meaning behind it, but I won't go into that. So if it does become an international crime, the graph at the bottom basically says it will become customary law and it will become domestic legislation. But it can also work the other way. So if a crime becomes domestic legislation, it can then become customary, and that would promote its inclusion at the International Criminal Court. So I haven't started my empirical research yet, but the case study I'm looking at is on rainforest fires in the Brazilian Amazon. Because they're one of the greatest threats to biodiversity, biocultural diversity and culture, with the potential to impact the global climate. Not all fire is, of course, the same. There are multiple drivers and fire types. So just to make it clear that the International Criminal Court wouldn't be looking to prosecute small-scale landowners or subsistence farmers, even if the fire did get out of control and become a mega fire in the tropical rainforest. It would only be sort of large-scale ranchers, anyone with culpability, which would be a CEO, a military leader, or a political leader. Someone with a controlling mind is what the Rome Statute says, that the only types of people that can be prosecuted. It wouldn't be you or I. My research will encompass two different types of methodology. It will be doctrinal research, which is the legal research method, which just analyzes the law across different scales and the application of the law and the use of the words, and how that might apply to different fire types. So it will probably only apply to the large-scale mega fires within the Amazon rainforest. After that, I will, by doing that, hopefully I'll be able to then identify the culpable stakeholders. So perhaps it might be slaughterhouses, CEOs, soy plantation owners, cattle ranchers, but obviously that depends on what comes out of the research. And then I'm hoping to interview the various stakeholders that I've identified through the doctrinal element of the research, just to ask how their practices might be different if there is an international crime of ecocide, because with the criminal law having moral culpability, it's what is being proposed in the research at the moment is that that the CEOs from various companies, etc., would not want to be put in the same bracket as war criminals and genociders. From the research I've done to date, it seems like there are positive implications of ecocide crime. It could work as a symbolic shift in the narrative. So because of the moral element of criminal law, it's likely that it's a very top-down approach just to say that large-scale degradation of the environment isn't acceptable legally anymore. Accountability and deterrence, so it might deter certain actors from acting in a certain way, and trigger a greener economy. Arguably there's biocultural benefits, and I'm hoping, and this is where my research will look specifically at, whether it will increase due diligence in industry. But it's very hard to apply in practice. There's, of course, a huge amount of politics involved, limited scope and application of the law because the way that the crime has been defined. But likely there will be some industry, finance, and business implications. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for a few questions. If you might want to stay here, Sherry, if there is a question for you. That doesn't seem to be the... Okay. Svetlana, yes?
Thank you. That was really interesting and partially resonates with my past work in ecocide area. What I wanted to ask you, or what is your view on if ecocide is recognized as one of the 4 or 5 crimes, do you see how science outputs might change in order to be providing evidence geared towards the as a supporting evidence in those ecocide cases. Would that change somehow how we do science, or how we actually provide outputs and visual outputs? Thank you.
So, I like to think that because the International Criminal Court isn't geared up with the expertise to deal with environmental crimes, it's predominantly crimes against humanity. Obviously, the knock-on effect of environmental crimes will affect humanity, and I'm hoping to do my postdoc in a genocide-ecocide nexus. But I like to think that the evidence will be informed by the local communities who are on the ground, as opposed to being expert knowledge, because, of course, the impact of the mega fires won't be felt by the prosecutors, and not for a very long temporal sort of spatial scale. It won't work. So I think I'm hoping they would be able to have expertise on the ground, and similar. So they have done it before with genocide, with certain elements of genocide. They have brought in special prosecutors and expert witnesses to deal with that, but I would like to think that they could use local knowledge. Is that?
Hi. So thank you. So just your work has been really inspiring for me. I work in Angola, in rural communities in East Angola, and we're trying to understand a cultural use of fire. So I think my question is, I haven't even understood it myself, so I'm going to try to put it clearly. It's kind of two questions. The first one is maybe a bit more personal one, and the second one maybe more academic one. The first one is did your perspectives around fire, cultural use of fire change when you first arrived into these landscapes and you got to see how fire was actually helpful and important for local livelihoods? And then the second one is, I think fire has this duality that it could be incredibly damaging, but also incredibly important and useful for local communities. As scientists, how do we deal with this duality to connect the decision makers with the local communities to create more just initiatives, conservation interventions that involve or to co-develop fire management? Because I think these negative perspectives come from fire is destructive, and how, because that's something I'm kind of struggling how to connect who's gonna make the decision, who is not, unfortunately, not the local communities, when fire could be very damaging. I think it's a complicated question, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So yes, definitely my perspective of fire has changed drastically, because when I first started working in Venezuela in Carmenta National Park, I had the view that fire was bad and it was destructive, and I just didn't really understand why there were so many fires. And it was only through doing research with the PEMON that I understood that there's not only a cultural reason for using fire, it's an environmental reason for using fire as well. And it's the savanna patch burning, it's the prescribed burning system, which is done in a collaborative, invisible way, which is what makes sense for that landscape, and it's necessary because it's a human-made landscape, but it's not a human-made landscape from yesterday. 7,000 years ago, there's already records of human beings being there. And that leads to your second question, is that what has happened is because of starting to understand the PEMON indigenous logic, not only cultural reasons, but also environmental reasons for using fire, and their fire regimes, the logic behind the fire regimes has led to ecologists and paleoecologists starting to do research on fire, to unpack from a scientific way, from a more ecological way, the logic around fire. So paleoecological studies have shown differently to what government and policymakers have said, that the Pemon don't know how to use fire, that they moved in the last 200 years, pushed by colonial contact. There's a lot of wrong understandings of the settlement pattern in this area that also shape a narrative of bad fire. And through ecological and paleoecological research that have actually given validation to the Pemon logic of using fire and understanding fire behavior through ecological studies, it has actually helped a lot for policymakers to start valuing and respecting and putting down the pressure that has existed for a long time. So what has happened there, and I sort of briefly mentioned it in the matrix, was this: there has been a development of a counter-narrative of fire that now says not necessarily fire is bad, is that fire used in the wrong way can be bad, but fire is a necessary component of this particular landscape in Venezuela, savanna forest landscape. And it was interesting because the ecologists have taken the lead in creating dialogues of knowledge, doing workshops with policymakers, pushing for a shift in the global narrative about fire. So I think interdisciplinary research is really valuable in putting the possibility of a different narrative to the public and to change policymakers. I hope that helps to answer your questions.
Thanks so much again, and I'm afraid with this it's already time to close this session. If any of you works with similar concepts or feels inspired by connected conservation and how it could be further applied in research or also in practice, then please reach out to Rachel or me. And yes, thanks so much to all of our speakers and also of course to you as the audience. And I wish you a very nice rest of the conference. Thank you.